This is Bharat FM.
बजेगा भारत झूमेगा भारत.
ये है भारत FM.
बजेगा भारत झूमेगा भारत.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Things We Carry. Today I have Pallavi Dhawan here with us, and Pallavi Dhawan is the Director of DV Policy for the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. She has spent the last 13 years in the LA District Attorney's Office, where she's tried nearly 100 jury trials. She is a Fulbright specialist in domestic violence and child abuse and has trained prosecutors, law enforcement, and advocates in best practices in DV persecutions. Pallavi received her BA and JD from UCLA. Go Bruins. I'm also a fellow Bruin. And in her current role, she works on improving policy, legislation, and prosecution in domestic violence cases and helped develop SB 1141, a bill sponsored by her office that adds the definition of coercive control to the Family Code definition of abuse. You've done some incredible work that I'm sure has changed the course of so many people's lives for generations to come. And I'm so excited to talk to you. Thank you so much for making the time. I'm excited to learn more about your work and also how you got into it. And as always, a huge thank you to Bharat FM and Sauce for Cause for helping this program happen. Hello, Pallavi. Hi, how is it going?
Hi, what a lovely and thoughtful introduction. Thank you so much for having me. It's going well. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Great. And I know that we had like some technical issues getting here, but we're here now, as we were saying right before this call. And I think in the interest of time, because I know you have to take your puppy to the vet soon, we can just like jump straight into things. But the first thing that I'd love to learn about you is, do you have like an immigration story? How did your family and you get your start like in the US? And what does that like origin story look like for you?
Sure. So I think it's traditional in many ways. My parents came to the US in the 1980s. Actually, they went from India first to Canada, and I was born in Canada in 1980. I was only a little child, under a year old, when they came. They relocated from Canada to a small town in Southern California, just north of San Diego, a town called Carlsbad, where I grew up.
Okay.
But yeah, it's traditional in the sense that my father, came to Canada to complete his education. He got a PhD in chemical engineering in Canada. And then he and my mother had an arranged marriage in India. He brought her over to Canada. He didn't have any money. He was a student, living on a college dorm food, and then, no money, built a business in where my family lives now in Southern California from scratch, built it into a thriving and successful company. But really it was my father who sort of, initiated that journey, and it was just him and my mom. Nobody else came with them. So it was I think a lonely journey. I mean, I say that not having been there, but sort of assuming that, because how could it not be when you leave the only place you've ever known and everything and everyone you know behind, and go somewhere, to start a new life for your children. I mean, in that sense, it's that traditional American dream, wanting to have a better life.
Yeah.
So I'm so grateful for them.
When they first moved to Carlsbad, I know you said it was like very lonely. Did they have like any family in the United States as a whole, not even just like Carlsbad, or were they like the first in their family to come?
They were the first, and they.
Oh, wow.
I know, and they remain. Their families are in India, so they're scattered in. I think they have some like distant, relatives. I have distant cousins in England, right? But close family, they remained in India, so they did it on their own.
Wow. Yeah. What was that like growing up for you? Was Carlsbad like a super diverse community? Were there other kids that looked like you? Okay, you were like, no. You're like, I'm gonna stop you right there. Not even close. Oh my God, what
That
was that experience like growing up?
that was an interesting experience. It was a predominantly white
Okay.
town, small town, like a beach town, a lot of
Yeah.
blonde people, like
Yeah.
surfers, and no one that looked like me. It's changed. Because my family still lives there, I do go
Mhm.
back to visit, and I see brown people sometimes. I'm like, there's one, you know. There's like a handful, but I was the
Yeah.
only Indian person in my graduating high school class of 400.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so it was,
Yeah.
it's interesting now having moved, now I'm in LA and having
Mhm.
moved through other circles to look back on that and see that as a formative experience because
Yeah.
I did grow up feeling very othered and not being able to fit in
Mhm.
uh, and also feeling, to be honest, and it's so weird for me to say this now because I'm now at a place where I feel so much pride in my Indian culture. But as a kid,
Mhm.
you do want to be like,
Yeah.
at least I did. I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to be, I wanted to be seen, and I wasn't, and so I felt
Yeah.
sort of a shame in my
Yeah.
culture. I didn't know it to be shame. I just didn't want it to be, I didn't want to be who I was. And now I look back at that and I think I'm so grateful that I am who I am. And I almost feel like were it not for that experience, I wouldn't have the appreciation I do for my culture because I didn't have that growing up.
And I think when you're younger, the last thing you want to do is to stick out. You actually just want to blend in more than anything. Like, how horrifying is it in middle school for someone to like single you out? There's truly that like safety in numbers instinct that maybe is like evolutionary or something kicks in, and you're like, I just want to blend in. Actually, I don't want to be like noticed. And yeah, I was going to ask you, I was like, was that
100%.
hard? And like, what after high school, after that like formative experience, as you call it, because in the moment it probably just felt awful. Like, when did you start coming back to your Indianness, and like how did you define it for yourself?
Yeah. It's funny because I think it's still ongoing. Like it's a
Mhm.
process for me. And it didn't happen like right when I left Carlsbad because
Yeah.
I came to LA to go to UCLA, as you said, for undergrad, and then I've stayed since law school as well. I was still kind of trying to find that space where I could fit in, and I
Mhm.
didn't really find it with the South Asians that I met in LA, at least at UCLA, which
Okay.
is interesting
Yeah.
because I thought like, oh, good, there's South Asians. Like I found my people, but I don't think that particular community were my people because I wasn't
Yeah.
Indian enough for that crowd because I didn't at that point in time have that connection to my culture because I was just coming out of this period in my life where I was like you
Mhm.
said, trying to blend in,
Mhm.
and I didn't mesh easily into that group. And of course, I feel like I'm only now coming into myself like within the last few years.
Mhm.
But it's happened gradually. It hasn't happened overnight. It's been
Yeah.
through repeated trips back, not back. I say back to India. I mean, I guess it's back. I wasn't
We're
born there.
all just turning into our parents, honestly, because like when you were like, oh, now I go to Carlsbad and I see Indian people and I'm like, oh, there are brown people here. And then when you go to UCLA, like, I mean, I experienced this. I went to UC Santa Barbara for 2 years and then transferred to UCLA, finished there. I was on the Bungaro team there, all this stuff. And I definitely think that like when you look at the social friend group structures of how brown friend groups in college behave, it is honestly startlingly similar to how our parents and their communities behave. And we're all just like, we're just reaching a point of convergence. We're all getting there like sooner
Oh, I
and
love
sooner and
that.
sooner. And so if I can imagine that if you didn't grow up with that, knowing like the norms and the rules of like how I guess like brown kids, brown people function with each other, coming into this environment, you were probably like, whoa, this is bananas. And I have no idea what's going on. Why is everyone in everyone's business?
That's hilarious. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. And I wasn't, and it's tricky, those friendships at that age. And I think it's tricky for women too.
Mhm.
Because I don't know, I found it a little bit difficult to navigate those friendships.
Yeah.
Every time I went back to India or went to India to visit, family, or even just to like, I went a couple of times on my own just to sort of explore. Then I felt like, oh, I get it. Like, this is who
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah.
And that's a really beautiful feeling. Of course, I don't totally belong there either.
Yeah.
But I felt the belonging in me, if that makes sense.
It really does, because I went to India for a month in September and I had that exact same feeling. I'm 25. I feel like when I was younger, I honestly used to be like, oh, I have to go to India all summer. My parents are taking me there. I don't get to go to any of my friends' summer birthday pool parties, like dumb stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this time when I went, it's the same thing. Obviously, like I don't fully fit in there, of course. But the way I can best describe it is like 75% of my identity is probably utilized on a day-to-day basis when I'm in India. But when I'm here, it's like closer to like 30 to 40%. Like it's
Ooh, I
not,
like that.
yeah, I feel like more of me is out and
Yes,
about on a daily
I love
basis
that.
there. But here, less.
Yeah,
So,
that makes a lot of sense. Actually, I
yeah.
like how you quantify it in that way. And I think that those numbers sound about right for me as well.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. So just going back to your question, I think I'm still, I feel really connected to like the spiritual, the philosophy, of Hinduism. Like I feel really more and more over time.
Okay.
I feel more connected to that. I feel connected to the culture in a way that I don't think was accessible to me growing up. And it's still, like I said, it's ongoing. I mean, I think like for all of us, our journeys are so different, but we're all sort of working towards a closer understanding of who we are, and what drives us as people. And so that is an ongoing process for me. But I do think that term you use, convergence, is one that sort of explains it well. I think in for all of us, the ideal is getting to that sort of place where you're the truest version of yourself, and that's the convergence of experience, and it's the convergence of age and family and culture and all of that just sort of comes together to unite yourself, like your true self.
Yes.
And so I feel like that's, if you can do that in your life, that's a real gift.
And as you've gotten older, you said you've like gotten closer to like Hinduism and even those religious aspects and everything. What are some of like the values that you think have drawn you closer to that? Like what's like resonated most with you, if you have a few?
Yeah, I do. I think just the idea, and this is like on a really broad level, the idea of just sort of just the most basic ideas, which aren't even unique to Hinduism, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think I relate to, obviously, I know I relate to most closely through those, through the tenets of Hinduism, like, coexisting with people in a peaceful, harmonious way, and not just people, but, all of life. And the ideas, just the simple ideas of karma and, I think I'm vegetarian. Like I believe, I just believe I have this idea, and I have a dog, which is not like a Hindu thing, but it's the idea of like animals, and people sort of kind of coexisting, and just being present and being aware of how your thoughts and your actions can have repercussions.
Yes.
So it's really like a broad kind of ideal that informs the way I live. And also just the idea too that everything is connected, and that we leave a mark, so we should really be careful with how we move through the world.
Oh my God. I completely agree with that. And also how you said that this isn't like exclusive to Hinduism. This is just like a way of life that I think transcends religions. And also like, I think many religions and backgrounds believe the exact same thing. And my favorite like quote that kind of sums this up in more like pithy statement is like, you are not as special as you think you are, but actually you are extremely special. And it's like, it's that same thing where it's like your impact is so massive, but your existence is so brief, like on
Mm,
earth in the grand scheme of things, is always how I like interpret that.
I love
So
it.
exactly, like treading carefully,
Yep.
because you just never know what someone else is going through. I think especially now with COVID and things like that, I think that's at the forefront of so many of just like the way we interact with people. It's like you genuinely don't know what someone could be going through now. You don't know what your impact is. And whether it's like getting vaccinated or masking or whatever, it's like you're doing it for some
Mm.
unknown, unseeable reason that extends far beyond you. And you have to care about other people to do this and not like behave recklessly and be going out partying, like things like that. So it was kind of like a tangential thought that I had that you're
No, but I
putting
mean,
that
it's
spark.
yeah, and it's definitely that's sort of like a universal. But
Yeah.
I think there are like the, there are ideas that are very specific to Hinduism that I
Yeah.
think like that as you were speaking were occurring to me. I mean, when you were talking about like, um, treading carefully, the idea that like, okay, this is and we have a limited existence on this earth. I was thinking, yes, in this life.
Yeah.
But in the next life, right? Like we
Yeah.
also want to make sure that we because I think we're constantly accumulating, and this is like a very Hindu concept, right? Like I mean, yes, like I guess Buddhism too, and like there are other religions that believe in this idea that you're accumulating this karmic energy, and so yeah, I think, and I do think too that like these lives and these we're all interconnected.
Yeah. And I also want to ask in that same note of like kind of the opposite. So you found like so much that you've connected to and has become, you've just felt like a really great fit with how you are naturally and with this like thinking pattern. But
Mm.
I think what's really special and cool, even though it's like such a lame word to use, is that you've gotten to explore this as an adult. And I think even if you didn't like grow up entrenched in it, I think so many of us do. And so we just perpetuate things, we just
Mm.
accept things for the way they are. But you've had the chance to, with like an adult, fully formed frontal lobe, decide what you're going to resonate with and what doesn't work with you. So in all of your exploration, like in your adult years and like going back to India more like recently and things like that, are there things where you're just like, actually, you know what? I'm so glad that, or I don't vibe with this, or like, this isn't for me.
Yes, and it's interesting, and I never thought of it that way. I love that yes, coming into it sort of as an adult, like a late bloomer, I'm sort of formed enough to be able to step back and not accept everything at face value. I love that. I never thought of it that way. Thank you for that. Such a
Of
gift.
course.
I Yeah, because I do work in sort of an untraditional field and in an area that is domestic violence, that is really closely tied in with you know these ideas that about family and marriage and what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a mother, um, and so and this is something that I think about all the time because I work in this field of domestic violence, which is not it's something that affects every country, every person,
Mhm.
every religion, right? Every socioeconomic group. Um, but I think that it is rooted domestic violence in ideas that stem from patriarchy, um, and at its most pernicious, it takes its strength from these rigid gender roles,
Mhm.
right? And so, and those exist everywhere. Um, and so, but I do think that there are, and this is a, in my experience, I don't want to generalize, but in what I have noticed in my experience in Indian culture, um, is that I think that those gender rules still do persist. Um, in my experience, and that's all I can speak to, I am a 41-year-old woman. I am not married. I don't have children. Something is wrong with me. Like, that's the presumption. I'm not saying there's something wrong with me.
I know. But I couldn't control
I'm ready,
myself.
you ready to like come to my defense, and I love you for it.
I got so annoyed just off that.
But like that, those are so there's two things I'll say about this. So these ideals that persist, I think when they're unchecked, they can carry into intimate relationships. And when it's usually the man, I hate to say it, but domestic violence is very gendered because it derives its strength from these gendered roles. If there is this unequal power dynamic that is in the relationship that's drawn from larger societal power imbalances, these domestic violence can grow and it can perpetuate itself in these intimate relationships and marriages. And I'm not even just talking about physical abuse. I'm talking about control, patterns of power and control where somebody, let's say the husband is telling the wife, you need to dress like this, you need to cook this, you need to do X, Y, and Z. You're my wife, so you have to have sex with me and you have to have, we have to have children. Like, and again, this is not true of every relationship, but where those imbalances do exist, those patterns of power and control are allowed to thrive. And that is something that if we don't see it for what it is, if we assume that that's just the role of the woman or the wife, and that's the role of the husband, because that's how it has been in our culture for so many years, then I think we are turning a blind eye to some of the most harmful forms of domestic violence or domestic abuse, that those get passed on through generations. The other thing I want to say is that I think India has changed a lot, right? Like, and again, India is such a vast country. I'm not speaking, I don't want to speak for the entire country, but I think the world is changing. And so that gives me hope. But I do think that one of the interesting things I've noticed is that the people who, like my family who came from India in the 70s, who left India, what happens is they kind of get frozen in that time period, right? Because that's what they know. And they're even surprised by how much India has changed since they left. But they're kind of, some people, and I've seen this, can get stuck in that time because that time is frozen in their memory as the last time they were in that country. And so they carry over the ideals from that time. And so even as the country itself is changing and moving into more modern ideals, they're frozen in that time and they're holding on to these maybe more outdated ideals. So I think, going back to your original question, I know I've given a really long answer. These gender roles that are still, I think, fairly rigid, at least in my experience, are really problematic. And I wish there was more room and more conversation around what it means to be like a proper Indian woman. I don't think that is any one thing. And I think that the definitions that we've carried over, that have carried over, and that continue to persist are not reflective of what it means to be a full person.
Oh my gosh. Okay. First of all, not a long answer because so many thoughts, literally where to even begin. Okay. So the point that you said about people being like frozen, I think that is so true. And alarmingly, I think even people who live in India, who are on the younger side, who maybe didn't even come here in their 70s, who are like in their 40s and in India, I have like seen men and interacted with them and heard their thinking processes. And I'm like, you have never left your bubble. You have become so entrenched in your echo chamber that you don't even realize what's going on right outside of your house, and you live in this country. So like for people to like come here and think that things are frozen, I'm like, okay, I have some empathy for you, because there's people who live there and don't see it differently. And I'm like, this is nuts. That's the first thing. And then what you also said about how these like gender roles and things like get carried on, and you've like seen how they've gotten carried on. I think when you were talking about how difficult earlier it was for you to feel like you were like accepted and in the Indian community, even at UCLA, and you were saying that it's even, I feel like, harder if you're a woman. I think that is also really telling of like the types of relationships that maybe your peers saw like with their parents and like in their families, etc. And I think that even guys my age in friend circles, in platonic circles, even still have that. And it's they just have never questioned it for some reason. Who knows why? But like it's so insidious and so alarming. But yeah, those were
That's kind
the
of the
main things.
double. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I
No,
mean, I
please.
feel like we could talk about this for hours
So
because
long.
that's kind of the it's like the double-edged sword of culture. It's such a
Yeah.
it gives you so much. It's so rich, and it informs who you are, and it carries you through the world. But then on the other side of that can be, can be wielded against you, because it's, if you're not conforming to what are seen as the traditional components of that culture, then you're failing in some way.
Yeah.
And then that something is taken away from you in that failure, or in that label of failure.
100%. And I know we started talking about your work, but like, can you tell us like how you got into this line, like kind of like what inspired you and just what's kept you in this line of work, which is, I'm sure, not easy. And I'm sure you've had to deal with so many emotionally difficult situations, but what keeps you coming back also after starting here?
Yeah, I actually kind of fell into this. I mean, I say that now, but it feels like the stars were all aligned, because I wasn't sure in my final year of law school what kind of law I wanted to practice. I'd always been drawn to family law, and I did an internship in a family law firm, but it didn't really, it wasn't interesting enough for me. And then during a career fair at UCLA Law School, I came across a booth that was staffed by a man who worked in the DA's office, the LA County District Attorney's office, their family violence division. And so I talked to him. I thought the work sounded really interesting, and I did a volunteer internship there in my final year of law school. And then I immediately knew that I wanted to come back to that work. And so I applied for and I joined the district attorney's office when I graduated law school in 2000. I joined in 2006, and I stayed there for 13 years. And my goal the entire time was to move back into that specialized family violence unit where I had begun as a volunteer law clerk. And I did, and I spent about 6 years in that unit prosecuting really horrible domestic violence and child abuse cases, attempted murders, rapes of mostly women and children, and it was horrible, and it was really emotionally draining. But when I was in it, I didn't really appreciate that, because I was so focused on like taking the case to trial and getting a verdict that would result in some, there's it's a guilty verdict when somebody and this is like a good verdict because the person who has killed their wife or their child gets held accountable and sent to prison, but it doesn't feel good ever, because it's like the person's life is gone and nothing can be done to restore them. So yeah, but I was always focused on getting that result, so that there could be some measure of accountability, even if it couldn't restore people. It can't bring people back to life. It can't restore grieving families, but it was a level of accountability that I was always pursuing. And then it caught up to me. I think it caught up to me when I had been focusing on exclusively for 2 years child abuse deaths. So where children were, and children like young infants, and were being abused by their by parents, and they would mostly end up deceased, dying. They would be dead, and it became such a heavy thing to carry. Speaking of things that we carry, right? Like it became such a heavy thing, and I got to a point where I couldn't see like light anywhere. It was all darkness,
Yeah.
and it was all just there was no hope, because the you know the case had reached a point by the time I got to it where nothing, like there was no hope anywhere, because
Yeah.
his life had been taken, right? So that is when I decided I need to move into a role where I can make change before we get to this point. And
Yeah.
so just luckily there was this role available, this director of domestic violence policy role. And it was kind of it was such an amazing opportunity. I applied and I got it. And now I work for the LA City Attorney's Office, where I work exclusively on policy. I'm not going to court and prosecuting cases anymore. I'm working on policy to change laws, to change the way people talk about domestic violence, to educate and train and improve the landscape for survivors of domestic violence, so that hopefully we can mitigate and minimize the number of occurrences where people are getting harmed and these cases are going to court. I want to stop that or diminish that. I want to do something to prevent those cases from reaching that point where nothing can be done and it's too late.
That's, oh my God, I don't even know where to start. I'm speechless. First of all, the fact that you were able to do that for 2 years and then like realized when you were like, I need to do something different. This is because it's all consuming. I can't imagine how this wouldn't become your life. I can't imagine how this wouldn't be like the thing that you see every time you see a child, or like every time you see something, like you're just, your mind immediately goes to like the worst possible scenario. And that is a difficult way to live. And the fact that you were like, no, I still want to do work here, but there's like a preventative pathway to this. I think that's incredible that you still stuck it out and you decided to like keep going and just find a different avenue in this still just really horrible, I'm sure, and difficult line of work. And hearing these stories, because I don't think there's any way that, I mean, I'm listening to just such a brief snippet. You like barely said something for 3 minutes and I'm so moved. I can't imagine you having to like talk directly to like the families and everything, and this doesn't take everything out of you. So first of all, like I respect you so much, and I'm just in awe of the work you're doing. Like I cannot believe they're real life superheroes doing work like this, because that's just insane. I can't even imagine.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I mean, you're right. It was all consuming, and it definitely took a toll. And so I'm grateful that I was able to move away, but still do the work that I'm doing now.
And how do you feel like I feel like when we think of like the legal processes, I think everyone is so disillusioned with it now. Just we've seen so many like police brutality cases go unpunished, and so many like shooting cases, etc. How do you see the legal system as someone who's like a part of it on a daily basis and really trying to enact change? How do you feel about that conversation? And also like, how do you continuously keep the hope alive now?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm a person, and I like to think that that most people feel this way. I believe in accountability. So that goes for police officers as well as people who abuse their partners. And interestingly, there's a higher incidence of domestic violence in police officer families than there is in the general population.
Oh wow, okay.
So I think yeah. So for me, I mean, it's different for me now because I'm not in the courtroom, working directly to prosecute cases. So I do still work with police officers who are specialists in domestic violence, like they work on domestic violence cases specifically, and they're amazing. There are definite problems in policing. I think it's the same. Strangely, it's like the same idea. Policing and police departments are cultures onto themselves, right? Like so there are, to the extent that there are ideas that motivate not all police officers, but some that carry on that are left unchecked, those can result in these cases that we've been seeing, where people think it's okay to use excessive force, and so I do recognize that there are problems in the policing community. I think that, and what I've noticed increasingly is that, and what I've been learning more now on the policy end, is that there are sometimes harmful, unintended consequences to victims of domestic violence when they seek help. So the most dangerous time for a domestic violence victim is the point at which she or he tries to leave the relationship. That's when the risk of lethality really rises. So I had cases like this in the district attorney's office where the victim would leave, get a restraining order and leave their abuser, and only to be confronted by the abuser and like assaulted or killed. So I've seen that, from my experience. I also know it to be true from the literature. So I think that, I'm having all these thoughts kind of converging in my mind, but going back to your original question, the police can be a great resource for domestic violence survivors when we have these emergency situations. That said, I have heard from survivors that the police aren't always the best resource. Sometimes a survivor will call the police and the police will come, and maybe they won't necessarily know like who is the person to arrest, and they might arrest the wrong person.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because, and this kind of goes back to the idea of, I think it can stem from a lack of training, and also ideas of like, what does it mean to be a victim of what does a domestic violence victim look like? What does a domestic violence abuser look like? And sometimes, especially with the really skilled abusers, they can manipulate a situation to make it look like they are the ones who are calm and reasonable, and it's the victim who is out of control and irrational. And so they spin it in a way that that ends up working to the harm of the real victim. And so that's like the one scenario is that the victim gets no help. The other scenario is that the victim gets arrested wrongfully. And so what I have been learning increasingly is that the more options that a survivor has, the better. And so police are a good option sometimes, but they're not always a good option. And they're not necessarily the only option, right? Like, so I don't think I answered your question.
No, that's okay. I honestly learned so much just now. It's completely fine that you didn't answer that question.
I don't even remember what the question was. I think
that's okay. I think my original thought was more so just that, like, I think like the general public feels disillusioned with not just law enforcement, but like the legal system as a whole.
Gotcha.
Because of certain cases that we're seeing, like going unpunished, not having accountability. And it's like, how do you, like, working to, get legislation passed and preventative measures passed, how do you like navigate that? And do you feel the same frustration that maybe the public feels? Or like, how do you kind of like keep your focus in mind constantly?
Yeah, I think, I just don't, honestly, I mean, it's there, it's existing in the back of my mind, and I'm mindful of it. But I'm so enmeshed in the work that I'm doing that I don't spend a lot of time, because I know specific cases where the police have been helpful. Like survivors have told me, this is working for me. I know of case like the police came and helped me. The prosecutor took the case to trial, and that helped me. Like I've lived 13 years of that. And so I know, so I see it as a problem, but I don't see it as a problem that should, that necessarily, like it doesn't stop me from doing the work, because I know there to be a different, like another narrative.
Yes.
Where
and not just like,
help.
Yeah. And not just like
there is
media.
something positive coming out of it.
That is so true, because I think like the media is pretty one note, I feel like these days, and more about what sells. And I think that when that's your focus, like what is going to get the most coverage, you forget to tell like these types of positive instances that you're talking about, because you know
Yeah.
that people just don't hear about that, honestly. And I think we more
So
so
true.
hear about those situations, like the woman in August when they were like going, the couple that went like cross country hiking, and
Mhm.
like she told the police and the police didn't believe her. I think like we hear more of those cautionary tales and those
Yeah.
negative instances than we do what you're hearing, which is like there are actually useful ways that this system can work for us and benefits people. So that makes a ton of
That
sense. And I know
yeah,
we're
definitely.
getting closer to time. So the one question I really wanted to ask you was, if, because you said, domestic violence falls on such a spectrum, and it can be as simple as someone being like way too controlling and just undue pressure in that sense,
Mhm.
to the most extreme fatal cases that you've also mentioned. If someone, I also can imagine that it's no one ever thinks it's going to happen to them. No one ever thinks that this is something that they're ever going to have to contend with in their life. What would you say, I think, one, to someone who is maybe questioning the nature of their relationship and what they're going through and how to like validate their own emotions and seek help? And two, if someone comes to you, how can you like be supportive to someone who is opening up to you about
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, so I'll start. Okay, so just with the second question, um, because each situation is so unique, and because of that heightened danger that comes into play when a victim is leaving the relationship, I think it's important to be supportive and allow the victim the space to sort of get to where they need to be safe. And that safety for a victim doesn't necessarily mean leaving at that point in time, because it
Mhm.
can be more dangerous for them to leave. Eventually, they should leave, yes, and they can leave, hopefully. But I resist these directives. Like thinking about it, like if my friend were to come to me and say, I'm in an abusive relationship, I would be hesitant to say right away, you know, you have to leave. I do think that that person should leave, but I don't think telling them to leave is going to necessarily accomplish that. And I think that
Yeah.
when we tell victims to leave or tell them to do anything, in a way, we are we are preventing them from exercising their own agency, which is what is happening in the relationship itself, in the abusive relationship. So I think what is helpful is to give them options. Do you want to call the police? Do you want me to call the police? Do you need somewhere to stay? There are shelters available. Do you, or, maybe you can give the friend, if it's safe, somewhere to stay. I think it's helpful if they can document what's happening, because they may not want to leave now, but in a future point, they might. And so if they don't want to go to the police necessarily, that you can maybe tell them to take pictures of the injuries if they have injuries, or the text messages, save things, document things, because trauma is really complex and it can do strange things to the memory. And so you want to have a record, even if you never use it. It doesn't hurt to have it. And I think, yes, how can I help you is kind of the governing thought that should be informing those conversations. Um, what do you want to do? It's funny, because as a prosecutor trying these cases, I would get the case after the police had already been called. And my position was, I'm taking this case forward because you have been injured, the police have responded, and now I have a case. So many times the victims would say, I don't want to prosecute anymore. I never wanted to prosecute. I didn't call the police. I love so and so, And my position was, it doesn't matter, because now my job is to prosecute the case, right? So, um, and that is the law actually in California. If a victim doesn't want to cooperate, they're not the person who gets to say drop the case, because the prosecutors aren't the attorneys for the victim. They're representing the state the people of the state of California. They're representing, the larger society, the public. So they're looking to the safety of the public, and not representing the interests of this victim. But but now having, now outside of that realm, if I'm talking about it not as a professional, but as sort of just a person, as a human who's, hearing from somebody I know that they're in an abusive relationship, I want to give them options, and I want to help them navigate those options in a way that's safe for them. And that might be calling the police, but it might not be.
Okay.
Yeah. And then your first question was what was your first question? I'm sorry.
So because it falls on such a spectrum, I feel like there's the tendency for sometimes us to like invalidate our own experiences and be like, no, it's fine,
Yes.
it's fine. How can you begin? I mean, you don't have to make the jump to being like, I'm a victim. I mean, I feel like that is like really hard for someone to do overnight, looking at their situation. But like, what are the steps you can do to at least like educate yourself and just, I don't know, like validate your own situation? And like, what, I guess, also thinking patterns do you see in some people who may be exploring that, like, maybe I am in this type of situation?
That's it's tricky, right? Because when part of the abuse often is sort of gaslighting and manipulating a person to think that they're the ones who are crazy and that everything is fine, and normalizing that. And if you come from a culture or from an upbringing that was abusive, you don't necessarily know to question that because it is normal to you.
Yeah.
So I think it's a process. I think it's recognizing that if you're not feeling, if something is not feeling right, you should investigate that through just, and that's a very, very personal process. Because you're right, a lot of people don't want to call themselves victims, even when they are really legitimately, like legally, they are named victims. They don't want to call themselves victims, and so it's less a question of labels and more a question of sort of intuition and of understanding how is something feeling, how is something sitting with you. If somebody is telling you to behave a certain way or is making you feel unsafe, you need to sort of listen to that, tune into that, and see, why is it that you're feeling unsafe, and what can you do to reach a place of safety in yourself first, so that you can then take the necessary steps to leave that environment. So I think it goes back to trusting your intuition, asking questions. Also, I think knowledge and information is really important. Information sharing, getting resources to sort of understand, because this idea of control as violence has not been widely understood, which is why I wanted to work on making coercive control a form of, codifying that as a form of abuse in the family code in California, because it hasn't been named. And so if you don't have the language for something, you're not necessarily going to know, if it's not named, how do you know what it is, right? And so if you see in resources or in the law, control, abuse means isolating, depriving me of necessities, monitoring my every movement. If you can, check those boxes and there's language there to show you that that is abuse, then maybe something will register. So I think becoming informed, reaching out to organizations like Sahas, or finding out more information in communities and in friends. And really, what it comes down to, it's like having these conversations, talking about it, because I think, right?
Yes.
And I know you're a proponent of that, and I thank you for having this conversation, because I think that's where we really start to learn more about, and we learn more about what's acceptable, what's not, by sharing and by not being afraid to share, and by learning and by supporting each other, and understanding that this is not, domestic violence is so often seen as a private matter, but we need to encourage each other to speak up and to speak out.
100%. Oh my God. I thank you so much for laying all that out. I know it's such a complex topic. We only get to talk for like an hour, but I hope that like at least one person, if they hear this and they like see something, or if they're going through it themselves, they have some information to be like, you know what, like if it's not sitting right with you, like you said, and there's that book, and that line that's like the body keeps the score. The body always knows before the mind does.
So
If you're
true.
always feeling panicked, if you're always feeling insecure, if you're like, and my friends and I always say this, like, you know that a situation is not right when you're acting so out of character that you can't even like recognize yourself, then it may not be you. It may be like the equation that you're a part of, and
Love it.
to explore that situation. So
That's an
thank you.
excellent point.
Thank you so, so much for sharing this. I have learned so much from you today, and I really, really appreciate it. And the work you're doing is absolutely, absolutely incredible. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Of course. And we will come back to you next month with another episode. But Pallavi, thank you so much again. And we'll talk to you so soon. Okay. Bye.